I would like to welcome everybody back, and we have our next activity, which is a roundtable panel on space traffic management, dimensions of data quality and trust, moderated by Matt Bull from Lockheed Martin. And so, Matt, take it away, run this thing any which way you want to do it, and looking forward to it very much.
Will do. And I think you are right, Mariba, that I think there'll likely be some lively conversation out of this this session. So I'd like to just jump straight in. I'm going to go down the list as it is in the agenda and ask each of our participants on this roundtable to give us a brief introduction, who you are, and your background in this area, and then spend about 5 minutes going through your inputs, your papers, positions for the roundtable, and then we'll come from that and start a question and answer. Please input your questions into the Q&A piece of Zoom, and I'll try to keep track of those and pose them to the panel. And I have a few of my own as well. But let's start with Islam. If you would please give an introduction, and then some of your thoughts on data and how it plays into our mission area here.
Sure thing, Matt. Thank you so much. My name is Islam Hussein. I will try to share my screen here in a moment. Hopefully it works. Yeah, Islam Hussein, VP Space Systems over at Thornton Tomasetti. Been with Thornton Tomasetti a year. Before that, I was with L3 Harris. And before that, worked very closely over these years, starting with my tenure over at the Air Force Research Lab. I've been working on the SSA, STM problem sets for the last 12 years or so. Regarding this panel on data, and I prepared some slides. So let's see if this works. Can you see my slide, Matt? Anybody?
Yes, we can see them. All
right. Okay. Well, so yeah. So in preparing my thoughts on this topic, I'm not going to come at it from a data quality and trust only. I want to kind of step back, look at the holistic situation with collision assessment. I want to basically propose a framework that is risk-based, that takes us away from our current collision assessment practice. And I want to show why we need to do risk instead of just some of these, the simplistic P sub C calculations. So current practice first. We right now primarily rely on a narrowly scoped collision of probability computation. This collision probability ignores the broader cost-benefit consequences of our available courses of action. We typically just compute a P sub C one-on-one between two objects and just focus on that narrow scope of these two objects colliding. While this might be okay today, this may not be very practicable or realistic in the future. Why so? Well, first, so there's one issue there. Second issue here also is that we typically use a threshold that is chosen independent of the very unique aspects of each collision event. And this can result in suboptimal false positive, false negative decisions. We may overdo maneuvering when we shouldn't. We may underdo maneuvering when we should. The current practice also ignores the broader context of collision events. We've in the olden days, we've had the luxury of a much lighter space population. The population is going to grow rapidly. It is growing rapidly, and the environment is going to get a little bit more complex, to say the least. So, and again, the current methodology of computing, relying on a P sub C calculation at threshold is not going to do the job for us. It ignores that data. So taking it back to the subject here, part of the aspect of the uniqueness of any collision event is that data itself for each event is unique. right? It has its own unique circumstances. Data may not just be uncertain, it could be completely incomplete, or possibly partially or completely untrustworthy. And finally, for some of the peculiar situations that happens in any collision assessment analysis, it requires a heavy human on the loop supervision, especially for special cases, things like a missing object. I'm not going to get into the details here, but we can talk about it in the Q&A. So all of these are some of the shortcomings of how we do things today. Instead, I submitted a paper to the conference, and what I recommend is something that others have recommended, of course, is to look at risk-based analysis for collision assessment. However, when I look at the literature and the work that's been done in the field, it lacks a certain mathematical cojones, if you will. A risk calculation takes into account costs. Risk is essentially the expected value in a mathematically rigorous definition of the cost associated with an action. So what you would do is you would compute the risk associated with every action, maneuver or not to maneuver, see what the consequences, the expected consequences are, and then choose the action that minimizes your risk. Typically, it boils down to what I call the naive definition of risk is to maneuver or not to maneuver. So there's this very preliminary, it would take us one step further away from just doing a P sub C calculation and a decision on a P sub C with a threshold. Instead, we can actually use a risk-based analysis in this naive definition to decide whether to maneuver or not to maneuver. And again, the criterion for decision here is the consequences of your maneuvering or not maneuvering. If we step back and remind ourselves of how we calculate P sub C, we can actually get a very formal definition of risk, right? It's just, again, the expected value of cost. And this P sub X in this last line is exactly the probability of two objects occupying the same space as the space X, where X is the relative position between the two objects. So really going from a P sub C calculation to a formal risk calculation is a very straightforward exercise, should not be that difficult. Why would we want to do that? Then we can answer all the 5 questions that I critique that I had, the 5 critical questions that we had that I had on my first slide. We can optimize as opposed to just using an arbitrary threshold. Now we can optimize the decision. And the decision is not just whether to maneuver or not, but how to maneuver. So the risk-based analysis is also prescriptive. We can handle every single one of those issues that a P sub C based decision it cannot. For example, we can handle complex environments where there are n objects nearby. How do you act in that case? You may want to avoid colliding with one object, but are you putting yourself on a collision course with another object? We can take it to the case where there is ambiguity on how many objects around you, because objects are too closely spaced, or you are running into a debris field. We can do such analyses. Ignorance, and Han earlier on talked about epistemic uncertainty to be differentiated from randomness. Sometimes we know, for example, that an object is lost. We don't know what it is. We have no statistical description of where the object is. We only can tell something about where it might be. Possibilistic statements that we can make that reflect our own ignorance. We can, in that case too, we can handle that situation very well. But here's the best part. All of these formulas that look very ominous potentially are actually machine automatable and are embarrassingly parallel to solve at mission level timescales. We can implement every single one of those calculations in real time. So the question then is, why not? So this is briefly my opening statement, and over back to you, Matt. Looking forward to the discussion.
Great. Thank you very much. We're going to move on to Darren. Darren, would you please introduce yourself and then provide a 5-minute statement of your inputs to the roundtable?
Yes, super. Thank you, Matt. Thank you, Mariva and Diane, all of y'all, and Ali for hosting this this conference these last few days. I'm Darren McKnight. I work for Centauri. I'm a technical director, which basically means I get to do all the fun technical stuff and have no profit and loss requirements on me. So I get to do fun stuff, almost as much fun as a professor, but not quite. Today, what I really want to talk about is focusing on trying to make this very complex problem seem simple. Because guess what? We're not going to get buy-in from the community at what to do next if we don't make this simple. Now, it doesn't mean it's easy. As Islam just mentioned, a lot of the math in the background is very difficult, but it's really important for people, I think, to focus on the simple parts of space traffic management. We're trying to avoid collisions. What kind of collisions are we trying to avoid? We're trying to avoid collisions that are going to terminate the mission of our satellites. That's one type. Okay? And that's going to terminate it if it's a cataloged object or it's a lethal, non-trackable piece of debris. And those are ones that are between like 1 and 10 centimeters, which currently are not tracked reliably. The new S-band fence by the US government, the new S-band fence by LEO Labs gives us a hope that we're going to start to be able to see these lethal, non-trackable debris objects, of which, by the way, pose 95 to 98% of the mission terminating risk from debris. So we do all of our nice stuff to avoid a cataloged object, and currently we're only avoiding maybe up to 5% of the actual mission terminating risk. So we need to manage that. And obviously we want to get the right info, we want to get the best measures to begin with, and we need to make that information available. So bias and residuals of radar measurements for LEO, or bio and residuals for higher Earth orbit satellites from telescopes. We need to have that information. It needs to be made available. In the last panel, people talked a little bit about that data not always being available. It has to be there, number one. Number two, we have to propagate it better, right? The longer we have to propagate it, the more the math is going to be harder for us to get with all these conservative and non-conservative forces acting on our objects. And lastly, if we can shorten that time, that's going to be the best way for us to reduce the risk, reduce the uncertainty, improve the accuracy. So I think that the good news is there's a lot of people out there working really hard on the math, but some of the major ways in which we're going to improve space traffic management is going to be some capital intensive things, like having more radars that allow us to propagate over a shorter time span. That will help reduce the growth of the uncertainties and therefore increase the accuracies immensely. So while we want to make sure we have a good balance between sharing data and using higher math, we need to make sure there's some capital intensive things like more radar measurements and better radar measurements that need to follow suit. So I guess what my bottom line is, when we're trying to look at how we're going to improve the quality of space traffic management, and by quality I mean timeliness and accuracy, somebody's going to have to bite the bullet and look at putting more high quality radars to support this mission, so we have traceability from those initial high quality measurements through the propagation, reducing the propagation time, and getting that information directly to the operator. A lot of my comments today are been affected by talking to operators. While oftentimes we want to talk about some of the really long-haired math about how we're going to take a look at the appendages on satellites, for most operators, they need to look at how they're going to balance, much like Islam just mentioned, the risk between, am I going to keep making maneuvers? What they're really going to come down to is they're going to have to figure out what's good for them, right? We cannot prescribe that. Each operator is going to have that themselves. We just need to make sure we have traceability from great measurements all the way to the potential close approach that they have to figure out how to manage the risk. It's simple, but not easy. Thank you.
Simple, but not easy. That is, I wrote that down. That's fundamental here. Thank you, Darren. Our next panelist is Pamela Melroy. Am I correct that you're in Adelaide at this point in time?
No, I've since COVID, I've been back in the United States.
Oh, okay. I was about to give you credit for being up at 2 o'clock in the morning, but
no, that would have been hard.
Great. So if you would just provide an introduction. Sure. And then about 5 minutes on your thoughts.
Yeah, you bet. My pleasure. So today I'm wearing my hat of the chair of the Technology and Innovation Subcommittee of the user advisory group to the National Space Council. So it's a FACA-based organization that advises the National Space Council. I'm just going to talk about some work that we've done in this area that led to some recommendations to the National Space Council. And I'll also put into the chat a link to a fairly lengthy paper that our technical subcommittee published that came out a few days ago. So, why does the user advisory group care about trust in SSA data? Well, Space Policy Directive 3 under the previous administration was the National Space Traffic Management Policy. Basically talked about the role of DoD needing to maintain access to and freedom of action in space, but put on Department of Commerce the responsibility to be the focal point for providing space collision avoidance support services. Now, as has been said repeatedly, I think today, we need more data from outside the existing space surveillance network, the certified sensors that are used to improve persistence and maintain awareness, particularly of dynamic operations, as we see satellite servicing and rendezvous and prox ops becoming more common. But of course, how do you trust it? So that's how it came to the user advisory group. The Technology and Innovation Subcommittee took on basically looking at some of the technical issues underpinning how do you have trust in data. So we had an extraordinary group of experts that we talked to. Mariba, of course, was one of them. Jeff Commers from Ball, Jerry Krasner, Tom Kabanchik. We talked to a bunch of people at DARPA, and we held a workshop. And so the submission today is actually not just me, but Mandy Vaughn from Vox Aerospace, who's also on the UAG with me. In addition to that, Jerry Krasner, Mariba, and Dave Gauthier from the National, the NGA. I don't remember the acronym right now. So you might ask why does NGA have a dog in the fight? Well, they have been looking at a lot of these trust issues from an Earth observation standpoint. So it's space data, it's a different kind of data, but they've been wrestling with a lot of the issues. And in particular, Dave brought up to us this point that you have to have some sort of a supply chain, a knowledge of the supply chain of, where is the data coming from, who gets to see it, who's doing analytics on it, who owns the servers where the data is flowing, sort of an end-to-end supply chain for that data, which we thought was a really important point. So we also spent some time talking to DARPA. I spent a few years at DARPA, and we had a broad SSA technology development portfolio. And so trying to get to the bottom of it, there was a program called Orbit Outlook, which in 2016 showed that it was possible to take commercial data and vet it real time and incorporate it. The problem was that it was a technology demonstration, and only towards the end did we realize that we had a data pipe problem. And that sort of uncovered some issues about data compatibility and so forth. And we learned more from some other programs at DARPA. Really, I think the key thing is that there are few major technical barriers left to the incorporation of commercial and international data for improved SSA and SDA. But what's interesting is this data compatibility issue really stuck out to us. And so here you have the Department of Commerce and you have the Space Force, and they're off doing their own things. There is some raw data, of course, that they're going to share, but likely Commerce is going to use more commercial data. Space Force is trying to work to incorporate more international data. One of the big concerns that we had going forward was if there are incompatible data architectures, that's going to really be a problem for data sharing and coordination. When you look at air traffic management and how important it is, for example, in the US, that the FAA and the Air Force coordinate together on air defense, but also just on simple air traffic. You can see all kinds of problems that can come up if they're not compatible. So our recommendations were that the Department of Defense and Commerce should work to create an interoperable approach on multi-sourced space data modeling, data sharing, and curation architectures. Both departments should study lessons learned, fund studies and research around technical solutions and processes that allow incorporation of properly vetted international and commercial data into the Space Object Catalog for military, civil, and commercial uses. We further went on with a second recommendation that DoD, Department of Commerce, and NASA should work jointly together to develop standards for data protection, space data protection and security plans, space data verification, and space data uncertainty quantification. And I think that's my time limit, so I'll finish there.
Great, thank you so much. So a lot of great insights there. I think you have a number of questions to address here shortly. The Q&A is starting to fill up. Keep those questions coming though. So now we're going to turn to Swapnil. Did I get the pronunciation correct?
Swapnil. Yes.
Very good, thank you. So again, introduction to yourself, and then about 5 minutes on your inputs for the roundtable.
All right. So my name is Swapnil. I just completed my MS in astronautical engineering, and I've been working on orbital debris or like problem related to orbital debris since last 2-3 years. Specifically last year or before that, I've been working on an approach where decentralized system could be used for SSA or STM. As for data quality, I think we need to define the data first and then the standards for the data. And for space traffic management, mostly we have been hearing about data related to space situational awareness, and both are kind of different. We need some data related to space objects, some predicted collisions, some predicted positions, some scheduled maneuvers, or some scheduled launches. So we need all kinds of data, and then we need to decide some standards for the data. One of the things that I want to point out is in 1970s or around that time, Dr. Donald Kessler mentioned about the size of 10 centimeter. And that was selected based on the available technology. And it's been almost 40 years or 50 years. And we definitely have some better technology right now. We can track objects less than 10 centimeter that would be, that would give some accurate results. And, and the next one would be the amount of data or like the completeness of the data that we need. So for that, we need more observations. And I would refrain myself from repeating what everyone already said. So yes, validation of data. So we need some kind of validation in this system. And for validation, we can share data, and the other system, or like if there are multiple SSA systems, the others could validate your data. That's actually an important aspect in this. Also, the next one is predictors. And we have models and we have algorithms that are predicting these positions for objects, but they are not accurate. And we don't know perturbing forces that are acting on the objects. Like we are unable to predict exact locations, and that is acceptable. Even with AI and ML, it is getting better, but it's not still the best. So if anyone develops a model or an algorithm that could be useful for predicting, it would be kind of like a vaccine for Kessler syndrome. I wouldn't call it vaccine, but it would be useful. And if it's shared with everyone, that would definitely stop a problem like that. For trust, I would just say that we need different levels of trust between governments, between companies, and between groups of governments and groups of companies. So that's all I would say about trust. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. And then last but certainly not least, we have Waqar. Would you please spend a few minutes telling us about yourself and your thoughts as relate to STM data quality and trust?
Yeah, certainly. So first of all, I want to thank Mariba and Diane and University of Texas IA for inviting me here. I'm looking at the audience. A lot of you have probably already talked to me about this topic, and what I'm about to show you've already seen, but we're going to go pretty fast here. So without further ado, I'll show some slides on what I've been working on in the past 9 months. Can you see my screen?
Yes, yes, we can.
Okay, so I'm going to talk about using blockchain technology to establish trust in SSA data. So what's the problem? The problem is we need to achieve consensus between multiple sources of SSA data that are decentralized. So for example, here we had a conjunction, LEO conjunction near Antarctica that Leo Labs was tracking, and they said it was high risk, which is fine. It was all proliferated on social media. We had other folks saying that, no, maybe it's not high risk. So as a independent observer of this event and looking at all these sources of data and trying to make sense of them, that was very difficult. So how do I trust what I'm seeing? So we really do need a system, a ledger, where we're all exchanging data officially and not doing it on social media. We need to get away from that. The other thing that I'm noticing on social media is examples of reducing uncertainty to a single word. We need to get away from that. For example, there's these two conjunctions that I saw. They're very close. 420 meters is very close, but we have no idea what the uncertainties are. The uncertainty is being reduced to a single word like about 420 meters or mere 110 meters. That's very difficult to then characterize what kind of risk you have because the uncertainties could be fairly large and your probabilities could be pretty low. So we got to get away from this practice using uncertainties. So here's an example of actually using uncertainty properly. The EU SST is doing a tremendous job in multinational space traffic management, SSA, SST, whatever you want to call it. But they are properly using uncertainties. They have misdistance and uncertainties right next to each other. So this is good in terms of interoperable standards, and they seem to be using good terms to describe a conjunction. Okay, so going back to that conjunction that occurred, that low Earth orbit conjunction, if I'm a independent analyst or validator, curator, whatever you want to call it, what are the questions I'm going to ask a person who's telling me that there's a high risk conjunction? I'm going to first ask, is your sensor calibrated? I need to make sure that you're looking at some reference target and you're looking at it accurately within some precision. And then I'm going to ask, okay, did you validate your estimation? Do you have consistency in your estimation? Are you taking care of outliers in your estimation? And then I'm going to ask, okay, did you quantify your uncertainty? Are you adopting covariance realism metrics or not? Show me if you're doing that. And then finally, then I would calculate the probability of collision. And there's multiple ways to do that. So we have to probably decide which are the best, or we could use different values, different collision probability techniques. And I'll get to that in a second. Okay, so here's an example of two independent data sources coming to consensus that there's a high risk. This is a conjunction between a LEO observation sat and another piece of debris. Both there's an ASW solution here and an owner-operator solution, but at the end, you have two red probability of collisions. So I've been in the room trying to make a decision to maneuver or not. When I see two red agreements from independent sources, and then I'm very happy because I'm going to make a decision off of two different people telling me the same thing. Okay, So on a multinational worldwide scale, why can't we just add EUSST to the table? We have 3 independent data sources now telling us there's a probability of collision. Okay, so now you get more confidence. Yeah, we're gonna move. We need an official medium to do this. So I'm getting at that here. But let's describe who are the players in this construct. You're gonna have data users that use your data. They should be able to access this system, this ledger, and request data that's trustworthy. There's data providers, commercial, government, all sorts. And then there's data curators, which could also be data analysts that are looking at the nature of the data, asking the right questions. These could be universities as well. Okay, so for those of you who don't know what a blockchain is, this is what it is. You have blocks that have transactions on them, and then they use what's called a hashing mechanism to basically fingerprint what's going on in terms of a transaction. So a transaction could be myself buying some Bitcoin, okay? And then all that transaction between the seller and myself, that gets authenticated by multiple nodes. And once everybody agrees that, yes, this is a valid transaction, that gets placed on a block with a hash, and that's endorsed. So how do we take the best qualities of blockchain and adopt it for space traffic management, global space situational awareness? We have to redefine consensus. Consensus has to be something where, okay, a data user says, I want observations on this object because I'm about to collide with it. Data provider says, okay, here you go, but wait a minute. Data provider has to be transparent and show data analysts, curators, what data they're about to provision. Those independent analysts, curators are going to look at that data set, and that data set is going to be immutable because it can't be changed. Okay, if you change it after the fact, you're breaking the link. So those analysts say, okay, yeah, this looks right. We used our techniques. This conjunction data looks correct. We have consensus, and therefore we have trust. All of these transactions are getting placed on a block and a blockchain. This is a ledger. Blockchain and distributed ledger are the same concept, and it's getting shared by everybody around the world. Okay. So now we go back to that conjunction request. Okay, so we make a request. One country says, here's the conjunction. Everybody else jumps in and starts validating it. They can do all of those steps I described, or they can do one of them. It doesn't matter. It's just everybody's independent. So now we're respecting everybody's ability to come to the table. There's no centralized database. Everybody has their own techniques, and we're coming to the table. So what does it look like? This is my final slide here. What does it look like on a worldwide scale? You have one entity here, one nation doing, working towards a collision probability value. They're doing independent curation internally with commercial entities, because that's how that nation works. And then you have another multinational setup, and they're doing their curation with independently as well. They're coming up with a probability of collision value. So you have your first order consensus protocols where you're doing internal curation analysis. And then you have your second order consensus protocol where you're using probabilistic distance measures to see, okay, these two objects are going to collide. The estimate of this object is overlapping with the other person's estimate, and these two sources have been well vetted. So this is, in my mind, transparency and a ability to use a ledger across the world to come to consensus. That's all I have. Thank you.
Great. All right. Thank you very much. So now we're going to open up the panel to questions. And we have a number of questions submitted through the Q&A. Please, if you have additional questions, put them there. Even if they're not addressed in the panel, they see people are answering the questions live in the Q&A app, and you can find some answers there. But I'm going to ask the first question, moderator's prerogative. We're noted bringing back memories of Orbit Outlook at DARPA. And I remember that Travis Blake at the time was promoting, pushing the cost, the value of buying data down towards the direction of pennies. At the same time, on the other end of the spectrum, you have satellites that are worth billions of dollars at stake. That's a very wide chasm between those two financial figures. Where does the liability lie for making these decisions? Is it with the data providers, if they're providing bad data, but providing data that's only has a value of a dollar or so, or is it all the way at the operator, or is it somewhere in between? Now open up to anyone on the panel.
So I just want to make sure I understand your question. Your question is about, suppose you're a commercial operator providing data at low cost so that it can be merged with government data. And so the liability is you're suggesting it might be on the provider of the data.
Well, it certainly could be. That is, I will say from a corporate perspective, that's a concern of my lawyers, is that ultimately it will flow down to the data provider as the root cause, and that there will be a liability for that.
Right, if whether the data is correct or not. I mean, in a positive aspect, it seems to me that could be an incentive to trust data if there was that kind of liability involved. If, in other words, you gave me bad data and it's going to come back on you, at least part of the blame. The problem is the structure of the liability regime at this point seems to be still on the launching nation state, right? So, anyway, my perception of how such a thing would flow is that you would start with the clear liability regime first, and if you had no luck, yes, going further down the chain, looking for people to blame or to get restitution from, it's not impossible. It's one of the many things that definitely needs to be addressed. And, it's the same situation we have with something which I think is wonderful, which is the, newly growing satellite servicing. But what if you create debris while you're servicing a satellite? And so really having standards around liability regimes are almost as important as the data standards.
Great. Any other comments?
Yeah, I'll jump in there. So there's a term called TCPED, tasking, collection, processing, exploitation, and dissemination. Tasking is what's going to get your data source. So we need to establish provenance along this chain where you task a sensor and then you determine, okay, I got some data, then you process it, then you exploit it into some kind of intelligence, and then you disseminate it out to the public. So if we're following this chain and making sure there's provenance and attribution along this chain, then you can start seeing how it evolved and where it could have gotten corrupted or not.
So I'd like to follow on that. I think one of the issues we need to keep in mind here is the value is going to be driven by the operators. It's the risk that they're trying to prevent, right? There's the risk that they have in their systems, it's the risk for their future. So I think for us to say it's going to be pennies or millions of dollars, I think is really not really very accurate. Now, if you're worried about whether or not there's any liability to be an SSA data provider, I think we can follow what's very traditional from the 18th Space Control Squad, and that is we tell you that here's the probability, right? So remember too, these probabilities of the events are not 100%, right? There's never been 100% probability for a collision. Collisions have occurred where the probability is 1 times 10 to minus 3, 1 in 1,000, right? So what we are doing is everybody has to learn. If you want to be for sure what's going to go on and be 100% sure, don't get involved in space. Don't do it, okay? Because you're going to be sorely disappointed. However, if you leave it to the point that you have traceability and you show bias and residuals and measurements, you show how you propagate it, you show the migration, the evolution of that uncertainty over time, now the operator can make a decision based upon that. And the last thing I want to say is that space insurance is there for a reason. A lot of people think space insurance is there to encumber. Space insurances help you, and this is, you can tell I'm channeling Chris Kunstadter here, for the community to embrace risk. So a combination, I believe, of space insurance might get involved, and looking at very tailored, direct data to the operators, much like what you see, Leo Labs does a very good job of this right now. They show you what the bias residuals are. They show you the uncertainty over time, up until the point of the time of closest approach. So I think that's important, because like many of the panelists have said, it's not a single point value. It's a trend. It's a number of probability of collision, and the trending in that probability of collision, the covariance related to it. If, I told you before, simple but not easy. Avoid collisions is not easy. And so I think that we don't want to get too much into putting data in and stirring it around. Let's make sure we have traceability so we can trust those results better, is my thought.
And if I may jump in here, and from a technical perspective, we know there is a large body of literature in the information theory universe that handles very rigorously in quantifiable ways, what do we mean by trust, how to assess the trustworthiness of data. And taking it back to my risk speech at the beginning of this panel, you can encode that into your risk analysis. That would include the piece of C calculation, that would include the consequences, that would include also the quality of the data, including things like how much do we trust the data. So I think my message here is we know how to do this. It's just that we're not doing it.
Great. I'm going to take a question from the Q&A panel here. This one here: would be interested in views about adapting relevant aspects of ensemble modeling, sensor bias, low latency requirements, and data trust from the weather forecasting enterprise. Any thoughts from the panel?
So I'm going to jump in real quick, because actually that was from Mark. You can tell he's a weatherman at heart. So Mark, it's brilliant, right? Because I think one of the things that we want to try to do is we want to try and get the perfect model, the perfect answer. But in reality, what happens when we see the snowstorm coming in? They go, here's a European model, here's a US model, here's how they're tracking. So diversity helps build confidence, not accuracy. Here's my physics professor coming out at me. Confidence and accuracy, not the same thing. Diversity gives you confidence. Accuracy comes from traceability of the measurements through uncertainty analysis. And I think the weather approach is very good. Another part of that is looking at how people get weather through subscription services or the free stuff on the internet. You get the free stuff, like a satellite catalog, like spacetrack.org, for nothing. If you want timely, precise, risk-based things, right, that's going to cost you a little bit more. And there are people that get that subscription services in the weather that's more than the free stuff. So I think it's a very good analogy, and I think we can learn a lot from that sort of approach. And that is, the weatherman doesn't say, here's the only answer. They give you some variety and let you as a user decide what that means to you.
I'd like to chime in and say I completely agree. Based off our review of the NGA and NRO approach to Earth observation data, it was remarkable how many of these problems had already been solved, or at least were actively undergoing solutions. And so we have to look at space weather and Earth observation and SSA for shared lessons learned. The only comment that I would make of caution in that area is to try to make too many close analogies in the business models, because they've grown up organically in very different ways. Making assumptions, for example, about how much data the government should purchase versus own and operate and so forth gets really complicated really quickly. So I think if you're looking at it from a pure data standpoint, I think it's a great suggestion.
And I'll pick up also here from Pam and take it just that last comment about looking to business and what we can or whether we should adopt some of their practices. Risk is one of those things that, you know, if you speak to somebody on the street and they will say the first thing they're going to think about is they're going to think about insurance and investments and stock, you know, trading, and how do you make your decisions. It comes from a very business place, but unlike that example that Pam just gave, that is actually a, you know, adoption of more rigorous, exhaustive, rational, smart, risk-based analytics. I think is something that we really as a community need to be looking more and learn a lot from what some of these other market sectors, like, you know, stock purchases and insurance have done. Like I said, the math is there, the analysis is there, the analytics are there. We should consider learning from some of the other fields as well. So.
Great. I'm taking just a gander through here. Take a question on, oops, my screen is moving around on me, on creating a more collaborative approach in data sharing rather than looking at it from a military red tape approach. What are the ways in which we can, both from an institution and a community, encourage more collaboration in data sharing? And what are the barriers to it? Anyone want to jump in?
Well, I can certainly bring up one barrier, which is that there are commercial companies that are trying to make a living doing this. So, you know, so far, actually, the commercial SSA operators, many of whom have been named today, I think in general have been tremendous in their ability to engage this community and engage with each other. And there's a lot of good there. I think, you know, fundamentally though, we're still trying to see what that market is. And at some point, if you're trying to make a business, you can't give it all away.
So I'm going to go ahead and add to what Pam said is I think in addition, not wanting to give it all away, you need to make sure that when you look at fusing of data, that the whole is better than the parts. And what really is, when you add things together, your answer is as accurate as your least accurate contribution. So one of the things I think is important that I put in my little op-ed that y'all asked for is, I think the data fusion is really, really important for a better satellite catalog. How do we have something, and Mariva, you mentioned this in the last panel, what's in the satellite catalog you don't have right now? I think there's lots of things that could be in there having to do about historical breakup tendencies, moving appendages, things that would make it more robust, that when you did have the real-time conjunction assessments, you might go, I'm conjuncting with a 3U CubeSat that's not maneuverable, hasn't done anything in years, or I'm looking at a tumbling SL8 rocket body, completely different conjunction, right, in my mind. But there's those two, I think, could be separate. And I think a lot of the power of this data fusion and collaboration should work first on that catalog, a description, and then the next level up. So that's just a personal opinion that we kind of want to do it in two phases. This kind of maps with the Department of Commerce basic services and advanced services. That was my contribution to Kevin and Diane on this discussion just last week.
So I'll add a couple more comments to that in terms of some things that are going to be challenging. Again, going back to consensus, I think we really need to make sure we have independence in when we're tracking objects, that there's independence between networks and databases. Because we might fall into a trap where we have two sources that are telling us something's going on in space, but lo and behold, they're using the same database. So you don't have independence. That's not real consensus. So that's a challenge. Is making sure everybody's independent, the sources that are telling you certain information or intelligence is going on. The other thing I want to point out, maybe this is a little interesting way of looking at it, is just respect each other. Nations respecting each other to do SSA, right? We can't have one nation doing it all. We have to make sure that, okay, the EU SST is doing a great job, and Department of Commerce. So just that will lead to independence, right? So that's all I have.
I would also add to this is, so consensus is the right way to go, but one thing that we need to be alert to is that consensus in and of itself, even independence in and of itself, does not guarantee, matching the truth, right? So the question then also is on the technical side, well, how to ensure that whatever consensus mechanism, formulation, definition, etc., is actually as close as possible to the truth. Consensus in and of itself is not necessarily has got anything to do with the truth. So there are interesting details in here that I think are worthy of thinking about by the communities.
Yeah.
Great.
So if you have like 3 nations and 2 are telling you something and 1 isn't, then obviously you don't have consensus. So you would follow up with increased tasking to clear up that uncertainty. That goes back to more radars and whatnot. But
right. But what I'm pointing out, what I'm trying to get at is not the case when we don't have consensus. It is the case when we have consensus. That consensus may still have nothing to do with the truth.
Sure.
Great. I'm going to have to stop the conversation. Unfortunately, we're at 1 minute past our ending time. I want to keep Mariva happy and keep on schedule here. Thank you for a lively conversation, good conversation. There's still a lot of questions up there that I wish we had more time to delve into. But I think we're going to, Mariva, take a break and then move to the next session. Is that right?
Yeah, and so I want to thank you. I want to thank all the panelists. Great panel. I kept myself from asking any questions. Clearly, I have lots of things to ask, but this isn't about me. It's about the community. So booyah. Let us take a break. 9 minutes. Be back here, and the session that will be coming up next is going to be on behavior incentivizing, monitoring, and assessment. I will be the moderator for that. And so, yeah, in now 8 minutes from now, I'll see you back here. Thank you so much.